This is U.S. History Regents Review, a review video on the major Supreme Court cases. These are the big ones. It's not all of them, but it's a bunch of the major ones. So we're going to go mostly by theme, but also by chronological order. So the first one, this is the first one you must know. It's called Marbury versus Madison, all the way back in 1803. An election had taken place in the year 1800. It was a bitter competition between John Adams, the current president, who was a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, who ran against him, a Democratic Republican. And Jefferson won the election, but in the last few hours of his presidency, John Adams attempted to appoint as many Federalist judges as possible. These are called the midnight judge appointments. Jefferson refused to honor these, including Marbury, his position, one of the judges. So there's some complicated details to this. You don't really need to know them, but basically the question was Marbury entitled to the position he had been given? And the decision was Marbury, yes, he should have gotten his job, but the section of the Judiciary Act, passed by George Washington, used to create his job was unconstitutional. This establishes the court's power of judicial review. So again, you probably don't need to know all these details, but you must know that in 1803, the court gave itself the power of judicial review. This is the main thing that the Supreme Court does. This is so huge. And to review, judicial review is the power of the court to decide if a law or action is constitutional or not. They are responsible for interpreting the Constitution. And this is really where everything starts. Marbury versus Madison. A few years later, in 1819, the state of Maryland brought in action against William McCulloch, who was a cashier at Maryland's Bank of the United States, when he did not pay a tax that the state had imposed. So the question, can a state tax a federal agency? Now, this one sounds mad boring, but here's the big takeaway. No, Congress could legally set up a national bank using the elastic clause, which could not be taxed by state governments. So again, that might not sound exciting at first, but it matters because this is where the United States is just a brand new country. It's just starting off. And there are still some serious questions over how much power states have and how much power the federal government has. So this Supreme Court decision clearly reinforces that the federal government has power over the states, including the power to create a national bank, which had been kind of a big question. Under Alexander Hamilton, the federal bank was created using the elastic clause, which said Congress could make any law necessary and proper for the functioning of government. So the bank is one of those things. And yes, it's totally legal. So it reinforces the power of the federal government over state governments. A similar one. Robert Livingston received a grant from New York State, giving him and his partner, Fulton, exclusive use of New York's waterways. Ogden obtained a license from Livingston to use the waterways and sued Gibbon, who had a different license from the federal government. What level of government could regulate New York State's waterways? This is the question. And the decision is that because since some of New York's waterways border other states and Canada, the federal government must regulate these areas. Again, not a very exciting case by itself, but here's the big takeaway. The federal government does have power. Again, it has power over interstate trade through the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So anytime there's something involving more than one state, especially trade and the economy, this gives the federal government the power to interfere, which is going to be a huge theme. Now, if you look at those three things, there were other cases as well, but the connection between them is the Marshall Court. So I want you to think about the question, How did the Marshall Court change the relationship between the federal government and the states? John Marshall was the Chief Justice during this time. He was one of the first Chief Justices. So we call these court cases part of the Marshall Court because they had a lot of influence over the future of the country, and he had a lot of influence. And what they did is they reinforced the power of the federal government over the states. That's the big takeaway. Next theme, Dred Scott. So this is during primetime slavery, right before the Civil War. Dred Scott, he was a slave. He was taken by his owner, Sanford, to a free territory. Upon his return home to Missouri, Scott sued for his freedom. So our question, is Scott a free man? Well, the Supreme Court said no. First of all, Dred Scott is not a citizen. He's property, and therefore he can't use the courts. He doesn't have the right to sue. And second, to deny slavery in any area was denying slave owners their Fourth Amendment rights to property. So the Chief Justice, Chief Roger Taney, essentially undid all of the laws before it that had limited slavery, such as the Missouri Compromise. Basically, if you can't take away someone's property rights, there is no such thing as a free state. So this created a huge uproar at the time among abolitionists and people who opposed slavery. This was a very pro-slavery court case. Plessy versus Ferguson. So now it's 1896. This is after the Civil War. Slavery is gone. But it's also right after Reconstruction. So the time period when they were figuring out how freedmen would adjust to society. So a group called the NAACP wanted to challenge certain laws that had been passed, Jim Crow laws, that had created separate institutions and facilities for blacks and whites. So they did this on purpose. In 1892, Homer Plessy purposefully went and sat in a whites-only train car, and somebody lets the conductor know. Again, this is a setup. This is on purpose. And Plessy is taken out of his first-class railway car because the conductor found out he was an eighth black, meaning he had one black grandparent. And this would violate Louisiana's separate but equal laws. So the Supreme Court gets this, and they ask, are Jim Crow laws, separate but equal, a violation of the 14th Amendment that gives equal protection to people? Well, the decision was no, not at all. So this ruling legalized segregation laws in the South. Jim Crow, totally fine, as long as they're separate and equal. But as we know, if they're separate, they're not really equal. And I think this cartoon shows that. But 60 years later, the Supreme Court actually will take a look at this issue again. In 1954, 4 black children wanted to enroll in an all-white school that was closer to their homes, but they were denied that because of the city's segregation laws. So the question came up, did segregation laws for public schools violate 14th Amendment rights? And the decision was actually yes. So this is a huge deal because it overturned a previous court case decision. This is why judicial review is so important. The Supreme Court can actually change its mind on how it interprets the laws. Separate but equal, the court said, is rarely equal. And it mandated that schools must begin to integrate. And this is really the big moment that launched the civil rights movement, legally speaking. So to reflect on those past 3, in what ways has the Supreme Court helped or hindered African American civil rights? The earlier the case, the more likely that you'll see African Americans' rights were taken away. At least with that last case, eventually the Supreme Court did act in the interest of African Americans, getting rid of separate but equal schools and causing, very slowly but eventually, the legal requirement for schools to all integrate.